How many times had he told himself it wasn't a good idea to close down the bar? It was even worse after a game, a win, a night out in a new town when they just couldn't resist blowing off steam, or so their coach called it. Except tonight was different, considering it was his 21st birthday, and what had he done with his 3 besties from the team but driven across the border to Vegas? Shit. He'd have smiled and laughed if it didn't hurt so damn much. Now here he was, unable to open his eyes past the thumping in his head. Not the music from the club, no. Now as he lay there in his misery, it felt more like someone was ramming a hammer, or rather a sledgehammer, into his head. The pounding just wouldn't quit. He needed water and forced himself to lift a lid, even though he felt as if ground-up glass had been scraped over his eyeballs as soon as he took in the bright sun streaming in through a window he didn't recognize. Right. A hotel room, of course. White sheets were twisted around him from what he could barely make out, and he didn't remember how he'd gotten there. He needed to move, but each muscle protested loudly, and his mouth tasted as if something had recently died in it. "Happy 21st birthday, Michael." He groaned and then immediately regretted it, as the pounding in his head was sickening. Even thinking hurt as he tried to remember how many Boilermakers he'd downed. Just thinking of the cheap whiskey with beer had him wanting to retch, as he somehow managed to move his hand and then slide his naked ass to the edge of the bed. He shut his eyes and groaned again as he lowered his head to his hands, knowing that he was in deep shit. He still had practice and another game tomorrow, and right now he didn't know how he'd manage to walk, let alone pull on skates and race down the ice to play the game he loved. Calling in sick wasn't an option, not when he was on his way to the pros. He forced himself to stand and squinted at the desert sun, feeling as though the sand was scraping his eyes all the way up where he was, at least 20 stories high. He looked down and took in the strip of Vegas, trying to remember where they had ended up and what hotel this was. Nope. Nothing. Just a haze of, well, what he was sure had been a great time. Water, he mumbled and staggered to the bathroom, where he turned on the tap and stuck his head under to drink what he could, then let the cold water run over his neck, his head, his face. Ah, relief. He needed aspirin, a ton of it, then maybe coffee. He took in his bloodshot eyes and the 5 o'clock shadow he sported in the mirror as the water ran from his face. His short dark hair was sticking up, dripping beads of water, and he allowed the fact to sink in that he was now legal everywhere. He'd have been excited if his head wasn't about to blow off. But he'd had fun, he thought, from what he could remember. He wiped his hand over his face, swiping away the beads of water, and caught a gleam of gold on his finger. He froze. Like, what the fuck? He just stared, and every muscle in his body tightened as he took in the ring. All manner of horror shot through him as he racked his brain, trying to remember what the hell he had done. A joke, a prank. Had to be one of the guys, Stu, Kyle, or maybe Nathan. Yeah, Nathan was always pulling something. Jeez. He hoped he hadn't dressed him up like a girl and taken photos while he was passed out, because that was exactly what one of them would do. He stepped out of the bathroom and took in the bed, then froze again when he saw blonde hair, the long blonde hair of a woman who was naked and sound asleep on her stomach with the sheet covering her ass. Like, double what the fuck. She didn't move, and he took in the smallish room, for Vegas, seeing his clothes tossed everywhere, a shoe by the door, her bra hanging over a chair. He took a step and kicked a killer red heel, seeing a long, slim leg sticking out from under the sheet. Where the hell were his friends? Another room, maybe? Like he could remember. So he'd picked up a woman and had sex, and there was a ring on his finger. It hurt to think, because all he wanted to do was puke, whether from the fact that he could smell the booze oozing out of his pores, or the fact that he couldn't remember.